All right, guys. So today we're going to take a look at the actual physical fighting of the war as best we can. Remember, this is a war that was fought over the course of 4 years in literally over 10,000 places. So it's very difficult to give a whole consideration of the actual physical fighting. But we're going to do the best we can, and we're going to focus on the political and social implications of the war itself. So tomorrow in class, we'll be talking about turning points in history because today you're going to be listening to just a quick lecture on turning points in the actual war itself. So the handful of battles that I picked to focus on are the ones that are in your notes. So you can pick up where it says turning points. And the first one we're going to look at is the Battle of Hampton Roads. And this is the quote unquote Monitor versus Merrimack, where the U.S., the United States Navy versus the Confederate States Navy squared off in what could be considered the first ironclad, or some even call these machines submersible or submarines. So the important thing to note here is that in this moment, although it didn't play a significant impact on the outcome of the war, these two floating monstrosities made every other navy on the planet theoretically obsolete in that moment. The point is, these machines with big giant gun turrets, steel and ironclad hulls, and the ability to run really low in the water changed the face of naval warfare forever. All right, so the battle that I want to look at and spend some time on today, are the two of them, are Gettysburg and Virginia. Both of these battles were fought almost simultaneously, and they're important for a couple of reasons. So in the battle at Gettysburg, the important thing to note here is that Confederate General Robert E. Lee had decided that a war of attrition was no longer going to be sustainable, so he decided to actually invade the North. Gettysburg marks the high water mark of that battle. In other words, that's the highest that they ever made it. And it's important because it has the most casualties out of any other battle in the war, and you can see some of the staggering numbers there. And the important thing, like I just previously mentioned, was that this proved that the South could no longer sustain itself for a war of attrition. And a war of attrition is basically where you just suffer as many losses as you possibly can while inflicting as much harm as you can on your enemy until one of you gives up. But the really important thing, and something that people often forget, is that simultaneously over at Vicksburg, Tennessee, a general that was starting to redeem himself, Ulysses S. Grant, was able to siege the city of Vicksburg and take it. What was important about this is that it actually was the culmination of Old Fuss and Feathers' Anaconda Plan that we talked about last week. And more importantly, it effectively split the Confederacy in two. And the easy way to remember this is V for Vicksburg. Think about, two fingers spreading out. V for Vicksburg was when the Confederacy was split into two separate pieces. All right, this is a cool picture. This shows a group of Union and Confederate soldiers on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg coming together and shaking hands over the wall that was the top of the most famous scene of the battle. That was Picketts Charge. General Pickett was ordered by Robert E. Lee to send his men uphill towards the Union stronghold on the last day of the battle. And it was an epic failure where, according to a lot of documentation, Robert E. Lee was seen openly weeping after the battle because he felt so bad about sending his men into certain death. All right, and this is the really important thing that should be considered when you think about the long-term impact of the war, and that's Sherman's March to the Sea. So General Sherman and one of his underlings, General Sheridan, their job, as they saw it, was to break the will of the Southern people. And in order to do that, they were going to march through and destroy everything they possibly could. Not only those things that could be used to sustain war, but also those things that might be used to really just live a permanent life. So we talked about some of these examples. They would rip up railroad tracks. They would burn down granaries where they had stores of food. And one of the really interesting things is that they would actually, as they made their way across, they attracted refugees, in other words, former slaves. And General Sherman is noted for actually promising these former slaves 40 acres and a mule. The idea being that if you joined with the Union Army and supported them in their efforts of destroying the South, that you would get 40 acres and a mule, which was not a very hard sell for these former slaves. Of course, this was never made good on, and that's why but a handful of civil rights leaders today still claim that slaves' descendants deserve reparations. And Spike Lee, the filmmaker, the name of his film company is actually 40 Acres and a Mule. And sometimes if you listen to Kanye West's old stuff, he'll allude to the fact that that was an unfulfilled promise by the federal government towards former slaves. All right, so the important thing here in terms of warfare and studying its history is that this revolutionized warfare. Sherman is considered the first modern general because he was willing and able to turn the war towards the civilians. Think about the impact of World War I, World War II, Vietnam, our conflicts in the Middle East. Civilians are acceptable targets in those campaigns. Think about the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's interesting to consider whether or not those heinous events would ever even be possible without the efforts of Sherman, almost 100 years before that bomb was dropped, 80 years before that bomb was dropped. All right. Now, the end of the war formally came after the Battle of Appomattox. And it's kind of cool if you go back and study the history of these battles, you'll notice that there's different names used for the same conflicts. And that's typically because the Union would often name the battle after a nearby piece of water, whereas the South would typically name it after the closest town or township. So sometimes you get competing records in terms of what it was actually called. But whatever the case is, the war was formally ended on April 9th, 1865, when General Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, who took over the reins of the government, took over the reins of the military from General McClellan, who, as Lincoln saw it, was not using the army effectively to defeat the South. So the interesting thing about this interaction is, like I've alluded to before, a lot of these former Confederate and Union generals and officers had served together in the Mexican-American War. A lot of them had studied together at West Point. So in other words, they had long-standing relationships with each other. So the documentation of that day is kind of sad. You see Robert E. Lee shows up in his best dress uniform, his battle sword, ceremonial battle sword at his hip, and General Ulysses S. Grant was suffering from a migraine, but they were able to hold this really interesting conversation about, places where they had been together before the war. And they finally didn't really negotiate, but the terms were given to the South. And basically what it said was Confederates would not be imprisoned. They could keep their sidearms, had to turn over their rifles. They could keep their horses, and they could return home. Grant ordered his men not to cheer. And according to some sources, as Robert E. Lee left Appomattox Courthouse, the Union soldiers present did salute. So I alluded to this before. This is Wilmer McLean's farmhouse, and the really cool thing here is that this is where the war was negotiated in terms of its end. Ironically, the first battle of the war was actually fought pretty much in his front yard, the Battle of Bull Run. And he moved his family in the aftermath of that battle because he was worried about the violence that might be inflicted on them later, and ironically ended up at the same place where the war ended. All right, so the last thing I'll mention before we pick up things tomorrow was that in the following week, Lincoln was, of course, excited because the war was over. He thought the campaign was behind him, and now the most important thing was to start healing the nation. But as we'll talk about in class, the real tragedy of the end of the war was Lincoln's assassination by John Wilkes Booth. He was a Confederate sympathizer, an actor himself. He planned, in collaboration with about 5 other potential assassins, to kill Lincoln, the Secretary of State, the Vice President, all in one night. Those other attempts failed, but the assassination of Lincoln was successful. So we'll talk about the fact that Andrew Johnson became the heir apparent for the presidency, and by all accounts did a pretty heinous job of handling Reconstruction. But we'll be talking about that in class over the next week. So we'll catch up in class tomorrow, and you guys can let me know if you got any questions. Thanks.